Welcome back to another book highlight. We are now at chapter 23 in My Father the King, and this is another very pivotal chapter. You just see the stakes raising in each one, and this is also another very special thing that we can take away from Mephi's life. Now again, you might be wondering, okay, you're talking about all of these things that are happening in the novel like they actually happened to Mephi, and at this point in the story, we still haven't, except for him breaking his legs at 5 years old, all of these chapters are biblical fiction. We haven't gotten to the point where Mephi meets David yet, and that's where scripture jumps to. It jumps from when he's 5 years old to at least 20 years later, where if you do the math, Mephi was somewhere in his 20s when he met David. But what's important is, as I've said before about biblical fiction, I have an article about this on my website, that these things, when I was writing this book and when I was exploring Mephi's character, when you consider what he went through and how he talks about himself in scripture and how, even his resolution with David, where the story goes, it's clear, based on what happened to him and the culture, it's clear what Mephi struggled with. It's clear what he faced, and we just don't know how that unfolded. But even though the way it unfolds in my novel might not be exactly accurate to how it happened in real life, it is stuff that we all share. It's common ground. And so today we're going to talk about another piece of common ground, which is the moment where Mephi is sort of confronted with the reality of this phrase that it was his father's last words to him. And it's been reverberating in his spirit for many years, and his father told him, when Yahweh is with you, your arrows will fly on the wings of the wind, because Jonathan was an archer and he was training Mephi to be one too. And Mephi has picked that up, and he now is married, he has a son, and he's an archer, and he's sort of found his place in the community, but he still has that root of shame, because, and every so often, people remind him of it. Every so often there's always something to remind him that he's not safe, because, people that hate Saul are still out there and still think that he doesn't deserve to live, and still think that he's cursed. And so even though he is witnessing God's blessing over his life, he's still in that tug of war with the other perspective that he grew up with, and the other perspective that he's kind of let in. It's sort of like he's in a tug of war between his father's legacy and Saul's. And so this phrase has been in his mind since childhood, and he's kind of discounted it, okay, that I don't even know if that was real or if it's just my imagination. But there is a big moment in chapter 23 when the town is attacked by Syrian raiders, and Mephi, in a moment of defending his wife and child, he uses the bow, and God blesses every shot, and he's able to save his wife. And in that moment, he realizes, and this is how the chapter ends, whatever else may have happened, whatever else I am not cursed. And this is a very powerful moment, because in that moment, he remembers, wow, God actually made my arrows fly on the wings of the wind. He is with me. And when my father said that, he wasn't just pacifying a little boy. He believed that God would be faithful to me, and he was commissioning me to trust him and to give him my life. We struggle with the same things, even if it's not as dramatic as what Mephi went through, Mephibosheth in scripture. We all struggle with that tug of war between who God says we are and what God says he has given us, and whatever we've been struggling with. But there comes a time when, once you surrender, once you open your mind to what God is doing and ask him to show you, he starts showing you not only what he says about you in his word, but specific personal things like that phrase that he has given you, things that he has worked in your life and personality all through your childhood. And you just thought they were coincidence. You just thought they were scattered along the path, but they were God's grace and mercy to you, specifically calling you forward and showing his faithfulness to you. So there comes a time when we actually have to make a decision and say, you know what, those other people's perspectives about me, or those other lies that are the shame and the guilt that are trying to get at me, that may not go away anytime soon. But I can choose to look over here. I can choose God's perspective, even if that other stuff is still there. I'm not going to wait for it to go away. I am just going to silence it over time by choosing to stand on what God has done for me. And at a certain point, you start to realize that in light of everything that God has done for you, it's actually an insult to God to continue choosing what the enemy says about you and to continue choosing to walk as a victim. Even though your circumstances are real, there's a certain point where you have seen so much of God's faithfulness that you're like, it's actually insulting for me to choose to stay bound when God has gone to such great lengths to set me free. And it will not happen with you, with us, waiting for circumstances to be perfect. There is a point where we just have to decide, and this is that moment for Mephi when he decides, you know what? Looking at the evidence, I am not cursed. And it doesn't matter how many people continue to say that I am, even though that hurts to hear them say that. I am going to go with the Lord's evidence. I am going to stand on the evidence that God is giving me. And there is something very powerful that happens when you make that stand. So ask the Lord today, where has your hand been in my life, in things that I thought were just coincidence or just things that my parents said to comfort me or whatever? Where were you speaking to me? And where have you been directing my life, even in traumatic moments? Go back into those with the Lord and ask the Lord, like, to isolate one moment of great trauma or pain or disappointment or fear, and ask the Lord where he was in the midst of it. We often assume that because he didn't fix it in the moment, he wasn't there. Ask him where his activity was, and he will actually begin to heal those memories, because he'll start to show you where he was at work, even in the midst of stuff that was awful that was happening. Take your stand in the Lord today, and your future will unfold for good.